I've got some exciting news to share with you. We're expecting our second grandchild at the end of the year, and I decided to paint some cute animal portraits for the nursery. After discussing with the future parents, we settled on Australian animals. In this video, I'll demonstrate the first portrait, a cute little kangaroo. A lot of beginners struggle with painting fur in watercolour, often because they try to include too much detail. They also tend not to work wet enough, missing the magic of letting the paint and water work together. Using more water on your paper can help the painting practically paint itself. Let's dive into how I paint fur, but first I want to remind you about my vibrant watercolour community. On my website, you'll find hundreds of watercolour classes ranging from beginner to advanced levels. You can subscribe monthly for access to the classes, or you can purchase individual classes to keep forever. In these classes, I guide you through each step in detail, unlike the shorter tutorials here on YouTube. If you'd like to try a free full-length class, simply subscribe to my email newsletter for access. All the details are in the description below. With this painting, I used just two colours, French ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I mixed everything I needed from them. I did use a little bit of lamp black in the eyes though, mainly because I was lazy and I wanted a really dark colour there. For the cute reference photo, I need to thank David Claude from Unsplash. I began by wetting the kangaroo's body with a large mop brush, and I extended the water slightly beyond the outer edges of the kangaroo. This allowed the paint to drift and bleed past the edge, creating soft, fuzzy edges that mimic the texture of fur. This technique helps to avoid hard outer edges, giving the kangaroo a more rounded and dimensional appearance. I mixed my favourite grey using French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I prefer to mix my own grey rather than use a pre-mixed one because it allows me to adjust the temperature. Adding more burnt sienna creates a warm grey, while adding more French ultramarine results in a cooler grey. So here I've added more of the burnt sienna to my grey mixture and I've made more of a brown colour. I also love the effects created when these colours separate on wet paper, adding visual interest to the painting. I'm using a large round brush. This is a Da Vinci Maestro No. 7, and I'm trying to paint loosely and quickly. Because I'm painting fur, I don't want a perfect flat wash. Instead, I'm aiming for texture, letting my brush jump all over the area to create a more natural look. While that area dried, I decided to paint one of the ears. Animal ears can be difficult to paint because of all of the little hairs. It's easy to get lost in the detail and you start trying to paint it as you see it. If you do that, it might have a tendency to start looking like it's overworked. I have learned over the years to simplify as much as I can. It really helps if you blur your eyes when you look at the reference photo. Here's the ear as I see it, with lots of detail and little hairs going every which way. If you were using acrylic or oil paint, it would be much easier to replicate that if that's what you wanted to do. But when you paint with watercolour, it's too difficult and I think it's much better to simplify. So when I look at the reference photo, I blur my eyes and this is what I see. Suddenly it becomes simpler and I can see key shapes more easily. Working wet on wet to keep paint edges soft, I paint in the warm shape in the centre of the ear. I'm still using the same two colours, a mix of French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I have mixed more of the burnt sienna into the mixture. I use a quill brush to quickly paint the hair around the edge of the ear. I loaded it with paint and then I separated the bristles with my fingers. You might have seen me do that in the rhinoceros painting that I posted a few weeks ago. Here I'm using the grey mixture, so it's a fairly even mix of the two colours. I also used the quill brush to randomly paint some grey areas in the ear just to create some texture. I moved it quickly over the wet paper. Then, before the paper dried, I switched to my small round brush and I mixed a dark colour using the French ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I painted that in the darkest areas. You can see the paper is starting to dry. It's not as wet as it was. So very soon I'll have to stop working and let it dry completely. I painted the other ear the same way, and then I started to work on the rest of the head. And again, I work wet on wet to keep paint edges soft and to help the colours blend into one another easily. I continue to use those two colours all the way through the painting, just adjusting the ratio of each colour. And then I thought I'd work on the head, so I got my big mop brush out again and I wet the front part of the kangaroo's head with some water. I use my grey mixture on the wet paper and I dab the paint on. As I said before, I'm not looking for a perfect wash of grey paint. I want more of a mottled or textured look to the wash. If it starts to look a bit spotty looking, I can use my damp brush just to feather the paint together a bit more. Once I got that section painted in, I wet the left side of the face and I started to work on that area as well. I added more burnt sienna to the grey to warm up some areas. It's more of a brown I've got now. At this stage, I'm focusing on large key shapes rather than specific details. I'm painting broadly to establish the base. Once this first layer is complete, I'll return to add more detailed elements. Here is the first layer. Now I will start to look more closely at the reference photo. I thought it would be a good time to get the eyes painted in now as well. I had previously masked off the white areas with some masking fluid. I started with some transparent sienna, then I deepened the colour and added a darker brown, and then I went almost black. In the centre there, I've painted some of the grey mixture. I'm working mainly on dry paper. And then I quickly soften away paint edges with my damp brush. And here I've got some lamp black. I could have mixed black from French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I was a bit lazy, so I ended up using lamp black here. When it was dry, I removed the masking fluid and then I went back and deepened the colour in some areas. Again, working on dry paper. When using masking fluid, the white marks left behind can sometimes look a bit artificial. To integrate them better into the painting, I often need to apply more paint, adjusting their shape and blending them into the surrounding areas. I spent a fair bit of time on the eyes. I thought that they were a crucial part of the painting. I wanted to give the kangaroo a cute and endearing look, just so that it wouldn't frighten my future grandchild. I added some eyelashes down below as well. The reference photo that I used was incredibly clear and it showed a reflection of the scenery in the eyes. I decided to paint that detail in, and I'm pleased that I did because I think it has enhanced the painting quite a lot. After painting the nose, I noticed I needed to adjust a few anatomical lines. So I re-wet the paper and I added more paint to refine the details. When re-wetting painted areas, it's beneficial to finish the water application in lighter tonal areas. This helps minimise the formation of tide lines. I think they're more noticeable on darker areas after the water is dried. Because I've got soft edges everywhere, I thought that I would introduce some variation by adding a few hard edges. So I've just wet the body area with water to maintain the soft edges there, but I'm pulling the paint into the dry head area to create a few distinct hard edges there. I've done the same thing on the left-hand side, you can see. I also decided to pull a few hard edges off the side of the kangaroo there. And then I softened away the edges further at the bottom with a wet brush. Since most of the fur had a cool temperature, I thought that I might add some warmth to the snout area. So I'm painting on some of the burnt sienna here onto the wet paper. This not only adds visual interest, but also helps to bring that area forward in the painting because it's a warmer colour. In the ear, I noticed a need for more contrast, and I wanted to define the patch of white hair protruding into it. So I wet the paper and I applied a technique similar to what I did around the jawline of the kangaroo. By pulling the paint into the dry area, I'm creating sharper definition along the edge of the white hair. And where the black paint sits in the water, it's giving me those soft edges. Then I could see that I needed a few shadow areas in the white hair, so I wet that carefully with water and I painted some grey paint in there. I'm using a little zero brush here. Then I needed to do the same thing on the other ear as well. So here I've wet the darker area with water and you can see I'm pulling it into the area where it's dry to create those little jagged edges. I also decided to increase the warmth in the ear just for some contrast. Mine looked a bit pale and I felt I needed to increase the colour here. So I've wet the paper here and I'm using the burnt sienna. At this stage of the painting, I no longer look at the reference photo. I look at my painting and see areas where I might be able to improve things. For some finishing touches, I decided to add a bit of white gouache to lengthen some of these hairs going into the ear. I try not to overdo this. In the past, I tended to overdo the white gouache. So I think with this sort of thing, less is more. It's not necessary. You could skip this step. But I find it just adds a tiny little bit more detail, makes it a little bit more interesting. And then I added some whiskers with some of the dark grey paint. And then I was finished. And there's my little kangaroo painting ready to be framed. I hope you found these tips helpful and feel inspired to try painting fur in watercolour. Don't forget to check out the links in the description for more detailed classes and to subscribe to my email newsletter for a full-length class. Happy painting, and I'll see you next time. Exciting news? Exciting news? How can I say that? Got some exciting news? Yeah. I've got some exciting news to tell you. That was really...
Be excited.
Really, I'm not excited. A lot missing... Oh,
we didn't move the little man.
Oh. Do we have to do it all again? We'll move him halfway through.
Yeah.
There. All the details are in the description below. All the details are in the... How is it? You keep stumbling on the same thing. Thank you for joining. Thank you for...